Is it true you can only absorb 25 grams of protein per meal? The idea that we can only absorb 25 grams of protein per meal comes from a misinterpretation of the research that states that more than 25 grams of protein in a single meal doesn't have much benefits compared to 25 grams. As we know, protein makes up a myriad of different structures inside of the body, including our bones, organs, muscles, skin, hair, nails, etc. The thing that we're probably worried about is the production of muscle proteins. And when we're not eating, the body is actually breaking down muscle proteins. Therefore, we're in a net state of loss. And the goal of eating protein is to stop protein breakdown and instigate protein synthesis, or the production of muscle proteins. And to do so, we need to consume a sufficient amount of protein to increase the amount of amino acids inside the bloodstream. And amino acids are simply the building blocks of protein. I've made this analogy before, but protein is like a macaroni necklace, and each individual amino acid is like a piece of macaroni. They string themselves together to make one big long protein. And when we consume protein in the form of a protein shake or a chicken breast, we break these proteins down into each individual amino acid, which is then absorbed into the bloodstream, and the amino acids are uptaken by things like our muscle and used to create muscle proteins. This process is referred to as protein synthesis, and it's how we grow muscle. And now the more protein that we eat in a single meal, the more protein synthesis we get. However, this protein synthetic response is an asymptote. What I mean by this is that we get more and more protein synthesis the more protein that we eat, up until about 25 grams. But after we have surpassed about 25 grams of protein in one meal, there's not much of a difference in protein synthesis between 40 grams of protein and 25 grams of protein. With that being said, studies have been done comparing 70 grams versus 40 grams, and seeing that there certainly are benefits of ingesting 70 grams compared to 40 grams, however, the differences are minimal. With that being said, people have misinterpreted the fact that 25 grams of protein seems to maximize protein synthesis into thinking that we can only absorb 25 grams in a single meal. Depending on the protein source, you will absorb almost all of the protein that you eat in a single meal. I say this because plant proteins are less digestible than animal proteins, and this is because they're typically bound up in fiber. The amino acid digestibility of animal proteins is greater than 95% on average. For plant protein isolates such as soy protein isolate, it might be about 80 to 90%, and for things like cereals, peas, and soybean flour, it's probably between 50 and 80%. The reason for this isn't because we can only absorb a certain amount, it's simply because there's too much fiber in some plant sources. But if we look at animal sources, we will absorb 95 or more percent of the protein. There is a limit, however, on how much we can absorb per hour. Fast-acting proteins, meaning proteins that we absorb quicker, will typically absorb about 10 grams per hour. And as they mention, at this rate, it would take about 2 hours to fully digest 20 grams of fast-acting whey protein. But cooked egg protein has an absorption rate of about 3 grams per hour. Therefore, it could take approximately 7 hours to digest 20 grams of egg protein. With that being said, the body has many different mechanisms to allow amino acids to stay inside of the small intestine, which is where we absorb the protein for longer. One is the fact that protein will stimulate GLP-1, which slows down gastric emptying and allows for amino acids to stay inside of the small intestine. And the more protein we eat, typically the higher response of GLP-1 and the longer they will stay in the small intestine. Therefore, the longer we have to absorb this increased amount of protein. GLP-1 may sound familiar because it's a drug being taken to suppress someone's appetite. You may have also heard it called Ozempic, Wegovy, or semaglutide. Protein stimulates the same hormone that these drugs are trying to mimic, which is why many people report that protein is extremely satiating. But that's a little bit off track. As you can see, we will absorb all of the protein that we eat. It just depends on the amount of time that it takes. With that being said, not all of the protein that we absorb ends up being used for protein synthesis because amino acids from the protein that we eat can be used for multiple different functions. Amino acids themselves can be directly used for energy in the same way that glucose and fats can be used for energy. Or, inside of the liver, amino acids can be turned into glucose. This is referred to as gluconeogenesis. And if this glucose remains in our bloodstream for too long, this glucose can be converted into fat. Therefore, it is possible to technically convert protein into fat. However, it's not the body's preferred use of amino acids. And it also actually requires a lot of energy to convert amino acids into glucose and then into fat, which is why there are almost no documented cases of a high-protein diet leading to excessive fat gain. Unless, of course, it's in the context of high carbohydrates and high fat. So I hope you can see that we will absorb all of the protein that we eat, and the idea that we only absorb 25 grams in a single meal has been discussed in many fantastic publications such as this one. The last thing I'll mention is because large meals of protein are simply just digested slower than smaller, more frequent meals of protein, We are not yet sure whether just one large meal of protein or 4 even meals of protein has a greater impact on protein synthesis. Meaning, is it better to eat one meal of 100 grams or 4 meals of 25 grams? But there is more and more convincing evidence that consuming moderate amounts at each meal is a little bit more beneficial than skewing protein intake towards one meal in the day, which is why most experts focused on protein recommend multiple protein feedings of at least 30 grams apiece. I hope this helps, and I hope you found it interesting. And if you're ready to take control of your health and energy, send me a DM to sign up for coaching.